Welcome to today's episode of EV Hub Live. EV Hub Live is a live video podcast for public policy professionals working to advance transportation electrification. EV Hub Live is recorded live, so to tune in and ask questions or check the schedule, please visit atlasevhub.com/live. On today's episode, we'll be discussing the key climate outcomes from our 2022 midterms and understanding what those outcomes mean for transportation electrification moving forward. We'll be hearing from Tanya Snyder from Politico and Rebecca Leber from Vox on where EV initiatives and other climate measures fall after this past month's election. Here's your host, Atlas Public Policy's founder, Nick Nigro.
All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to EV Hub Live. My name is Nick Nigro. I'm your host, and we're going to talk midterm elections and what it means for climate, energy, and more specifically, EVs. I'm joined by two experts on this topic, Tanya from Politico and Rebecca from Vox. I really appreciate you both joining me today on the show, and let's just jump right into it. So last week, the last of the races were called. And aside from Senate runoff that's in early voting right now in Georgia, we got a pretty clear picture of what the Congress is going to look like. I will say from my perspective, this is not exactly how I thought the election was going to go based on all the press coverage and talking heads leading up to it. But here we are. Tanya, let's start right with you. Can you talk about the results we saw in Congress and what you think it means for climate action, climate priorities, EVs, that sort of thing?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me, first of all. And you're right. This election did not go the way most people thought it was going to go, most especially the Republicans who are predicting a red wave. Republicans will control the House, though with a slim and by all accounts unruly majority. The Senate will stay in the hands of Democrats, also with a very slim majority. It remains to be seen how ruly or unruly. With a split government, I don't think, and of course the president is still a Democrat. So with a split government, I don't think that we can expect really big policy changes. And certainly a Democratic Senate and Democratic White House would have something to say about any major changes to climate, energy, EV policy that the Republican House would try to pass. So I don't think that we are expecting really big policy changes, even if the House were able to pass anything itself. One possibility that I'm looking at is possible changes to permitting rules for energy projects, though I think that even that would be a pretty tough lift. They were not able to get that done this Congress. Specifically for EVs, Republicans have gone from a posture of wanting to take away the EV tax credit, even impose a fee on EVs so that because electric vehicle owners don't pay the gas tax, they don't really pay their share for the use of the roads. So that was something that Republicans were trying to do a little while ago. But really, there's a whole new landscape for EVs now. And Republicans have taken a somewhat different approach to it. The tax incentives have changed. Battery production is being brought to the United States with the help of federal money. There are more and more EV and battery plants popping up all over the country, but especially in red states. Used cars are going to be eligible for the tax credits, and as well as Teslas and other cars that had kind of capped out at their 200,000 units. And of course, there's billions and billions of dollars in federal money going into building charging stations all over the country. And really none of that is likely to change with the new Congress.
It's really interesting you're saying this just because, when you think about the history of EVs going back to, in the early 2010s, they were such a partisan issue. And what I hear you kind of saying is it's almost over the hump on that.
To a certain extent, I think that's true. I think that Republicans haven't necessarily they haven't necessarily incorporated the new landscape into their talking points, and so much of it is just happening at the executive level now with DOT and the White House. Now that the infrastructure bill is more than a year old, it's kind of out of Congress's hands.
hmm Yeah, it's interesting you said about the talking points thing, because let's turn to the states where a lot of the action was happening in the last couple of years. Rebecca, you wrote about races and places where Democrats either won a majority or prevented veto-proof majorities. Can you talk about a few of those examples and what it means to climate, energy, EVs, that sort of thing?
Yeah, like Tanya said, I think the results here were a little different than what we expected
hmm
because I think going into the election, I was pre-writing, and braced for a massive change at the state level too, where Republicans would sweep states with some new supermajorities. But that's not quite what happened. Democrats performed a lot better than what we expected, and so there's a lot of states. A good shortcut is most of them start with M's that are important to watch. And Democrats gained majority of the state legislature, or they gained a governor's seat in 4 new states. So Michigan, Minnesota, Maryland, and Massachusetts.
hmm
So those would be states to watch next year of how Democrats might push new targets like 100% clean energy. I think that has traditionally applied to the power sector, but increasingly, I think Democrats are looking at transportation because that's our largest source of pollution. So incorporating EV infrastructure into these targets and setting goals. I know Minnesota specifically has had bills that it was unable to pass before this Democratic majority that would boost EV infrastructure. So that would be something to watch for next year. And on the other flip side, the GOP seem poised to gain supermajorities in a few states. So in North Carolina, that's hugely important because the governor is Democratic and has actually vetoed a few bills passed by the legislature that would pull back the state's climate goals.
hmm
So Democrats actually prevented that by a single seat. So that's a very slim
Yeah.
margin there, but that might be enough to prevent the legislator from being able to override the governor's veto in North Carolina.
hmm
Now in Montana, Republicans actually did gain a supermajority, which could mean that the state sees some pulling back. Particularly in the state constitution, it has laid out a protection for the environment that Republicans seem poised to repeal. I think generally we will see, for the most part, more states moving forward on its climate and transportation goals, rather than this reversal we expected if Republicans sweep new states. So on the state level, it actually looks a lot more optimistic than if you asked me a month ago.
That sounds similar to what Tanya's saying about what's going on at the federal level. And so, let's stick with you, Rebecca, because, it seems like the election was a surprise to many. Was climate, energy, EVs, were these actually on the ballot? Were candidates running on these issues, and did they win or lose because of it?
Yeah, I think climate played a really interesting role in this election. I wouldn't maybe say this was the top tier issue. I don't think candidates on either side were talking about it quite as much as we saw in the 2020 election. What I think is actually most interesting to watch is how Republicans messaged around the Inflation Reduction Act that Democrats passed this summer. I think what I initially expected was this to be factor into a lot of talking points and attacks on Democrats, similar to what we saw during the Tea Party wave when Democrats passed the Affordable Care Act in 2010, and there was this huge backlash. That backlash didn't happen. Republicans have attacked the bill, the law, but they were shying away from the climate pieces of the law, which is the biggest part of what passed. I think that shows the growing weight that clean energy industry and EVs have in American politics and the economy, that this wasn't quite a winning talking point or attack for Republicans in the way that it used to be. So climate showed up in other ways, though, in the midterms. I think, of course, inflation and energy prices were a huge talking point. But as we saw in the results, this didn't resonate with voters quite in the way that Republicans thought, because in a lot of places and Senate seats that they still voted for the sitting party, even with high inflation and energy prices. I think showing again that a lot of energy prices are not dictated by President Biden. They are not set by the ruling party either side. So I think that's interesting how that didn't quite resonate with voters in the same way. And the other issue I would flag that I think surprisingly factored in Republican attacks were around ESG, which is shorthand for environmental, social, government investing. This has been a growing area of attacks from the right on the corporate world's approach to evaluating climate risk. And we saw this start to really filter into a lot of attack ads at the state level. It also affects EV investments because this is how the business community is evaluating future its future investments in environmental issues. And I think that's going to be a growing issue basically to watch.
So I just got to ask you about this ESG thing, because it's like, when you're going into the election booth, you're not voting for a company. So I guess what is the play there? Is that like vote for us and we'll tell corporations to like change their ESG policy? I don't even understand what the platform would be.
Yeah, this is fascinating. I'm working on a story about this right now. I think this is an area that is very new, and it's confusing even to the experts in this space what is going on here. So I don't think this isn't an issue that's driving voters at all. I have no evidence that this really factored into the actual results of the election. Right. But what it is doing is playing into this larger culture war that that Republicans have generated. We have seen this with the critical race theory attacks. I think Republicans have called this woke capitalism. So
there's like a book about that, I think, or something that gets a ton of attention, right? Yeah.
I think this is just something to be watching, because Republicans have struggled for a few years now to find a solid messaging point around climate change. And this might be the strategy they're starting to settle on in terms of making this more of a cultural debate.
Okay. Yeah. It's interesting to try to connect the banks and culture and all of that stuff. I'm not sure how all that comes together. Tanya, let's go back to you. Before the Inflation Reduction Act was enacted, a year before that, we had the bipartisan infrastructure law, the infrastructure bill that was huge, historic investments in all kinds of parts of infrastructure, including some good funding for EVs. What role do you think that the bill, as it's called, BIL, played in the election?
Right. It was the BIF, and then the BID, the bipartisan infrastructure framework, and then the bipartisan infrastructure deal, and then the bipartisan infrastructure law. So yes, the bill. And that was really, for a long time, all Democrats had to run on, because the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS bill, two other major pieces of legislation that they had to promote once the election actually rolled around, those came a lot later. Those happened during the summer. So for a good part of 2021, the Democrats 2022, really what the Democrats had to promote in terms of their legislative achievements, as having all of the reins of power in Washington, the White House and both chambers of Congress, was really the infrastructure law. And it was hard. I think infrastructure is not the sexiest issue, to my great chagrin, and it is, and it's hard for people to see. First of all, the difference between the infrastructure laws, kind of enhanced funding, and just sort of normal maintenance, repair, roads, bridges kinds of work that you expect from your city's public works department or your state DOT. So it can be hard to tease out the differences. And honestly, we haven't seen a lot of this money hit the street yet. It takes a long time. Infrastructure money takes a long time. Government granting takes a long time. So I think that that Democrats definitely tried to run on infrastructure, but I think that for those reasons, it was a little bit hard. I will say, though, that it just so happens that the Biden administration's best ambassador, most effective communicator happens to be its transportation secretary. So they trot Pete Buttigieg out a lot because he's a good communicator for the administration, and a good surrogate for Democrats in general. And he also happens to be the person in charge of most of the money in the infrastructure law, and that's something that he likes to talk about, obviously. So that's one kind of point in the infrastructure law's favor. But I think that it was of mild utility for Democrats in the election.
So just to follow up on that, so the law passed in 21. 22, it didn't really play a big role because they're still setting up rules, regulations, and whatever to distribute the funds. But fast forward a year or two, a lot of the money's going to have been spent. Do you think then that it's going to be something that will rise in the public consciousness for the 24 election?
Again, I think it can be tricky because I think that states get to take a lot of the credit for it. Cities get to take a lot of the credit for it. I think that it can get muddied. And then at that point, we'll have had a Republican House. And people aren't going to remember, under which Congress this got passed under.
Right. Yeah.
I will say also that personally, my local news had a story about how DC is going to be spending our piece of the infrastructure law 9 days after the election. And it was truly, I think I was surprised how much of an impact it had on me personally. I mean, I know a lot about this law. I know a lot about how it's going to be spent, and seeing how it's going to affect my life and my neighborhood and my commute, how it's going to make, horrible traffic clogged, impassable, unsafe corridors in my city easy, safe, pleasant to bike on, walk on. It's going to make traffic better. It's going to make transit better. Seeing that for myself and how it's going to impact my life was meaningful and is meaningful to me. But I didn't even get to see that till 9 days after the election. Do
you get a favorite project that you want to plug for DDOT? I mean, I saw those too, and I was like, wow, this is really going to have an impact. These are not just like filling potholes; these are doing major construction. Yeah, I think that North Capitol Street is is such a terrible corridor right now. It is it's dangerous. It's unpleasant. It's just very trafficky. Parts of it kind of go underneath other streets instead of crossing them. And it really just interrupts the flow of that neighborhood. And to see that become a more walkable, bikeable boulevard would be just game changing for the whole city. Mm-hmm.
That's fascinating. I didn't actually realize that was connected to the infrastructure law. One of my favorite projects to plug that I think will have real impact in communities is the work to electrify and reduce diesel from school buses. There's not enough funding to cover every school bus by any imagination in that law, but I do think it will make a big impact in the communities that do receive that funding. There's lots of studies showing how that results in disparate impacts for kids who have developing lungs and bodies, and it's just so unhealthy for them to breathe in that diesel air.
Yeah, we covered that in an episode over the summer of EV Hub Live. It's pretty groundbreaking. EPA doesn't do a lot of funding in this way, so it's gonna make a big deal for sure.
And those buses just idle outside of schools for hours.
Yeah, for sure. Rebecca, let's go back to the state issues. California had an EV ballot measure, which most people from the outside would be like, well, they must have passed that one because they always want to spend more on electric vehicles in California, since something like 50% of sales are still there. What was going on there, and why did they actually vote it down?
Yeah, I wish this ballot measure hadn't flown so under the radar, I think, nationally until the very end, because ultimately it was voted down, which on the face of it is surprising for California because of its leading role in climate policy. I think fundamentally there was a lot of misunderstanding over what it would do. So this was a proposal, Prop 30, to raise taxes on the state's wealthiest and basically accelerate electric vehicles, largely among low-income residents. So I think it's pretty surprising that that was voted down by a wide margin. I think it was almost 60%.
Well, the governor was against it, right?
Yeah. So this basically California is trying to reduce its transportation emissions. Is a huge source of its pollution. I think the largest source of its pollution. And the state has set goals to boost its EV sales by 2030. So it needs money to get there. But what happened was this was a ballot initiative that was not sponsored, but supported in a large way by the company Lyft. It was by far the largest funding for passing this initiative. And on the other side, there was a strange coalition of groups and individuals that were opposed to it. The obvious ones were people who have income excess of $2 million a year, because what this would do is raise taxes by 1.75% on income over $2 million. So that's how wealthy we're talking about. So Governor Gavin Newsom opposed it. There's a lot of theories why he did. His benefactors also happen to be some of these wealthiest individuals. And I think what we saw in polling was actually 2/3 of voters supported this proposition. But around the time that the governor started appearing in ads attacking this as a giveaway to Lyft, that's when the polling significantly dropped and more voters started opposing it. So I do think that was a really important turning point here. But fundamentally, I think there was a lot of misunderstanding over what this would do. There were different buckets of funding, but the biggest portion would go to boosting EV infrastructure and offering tax credits and incentives for California residents. But because of state law, about 40% has to go to low-income residents. But Newsom framed this as this giveaway for Lyft, which it had no specific carve-outs for Lyft. But why was
Lyft pouring so much money into advocating for it?
Yeah, so because of California's goals and other states that are likely to follow, the state is going to have to see a lot more EVs on the road. What this means for a company like Lyft that is relying on individual drivers essentially is it's not quite clear how a company like Lyft would be affected here, because you can imagine a lot of Lyft's drivers, they might fall into this lower income bracket. The burden is on them to get these cars, and they are worried about having to fork over their own money to help drivers reach these goals so they can continue to drive on the road and meet and also comply with California law that requires new car sales to be EVs. So it's a really, I don't think this proposition really benefited from Lyft being a face of it. It's important to add, Lyft wasn't the only group and company to support it. There were lots of climate groups and climate justice groups that were also in favor. They just were responsible for a lot less of the funding.
It's just an interesting story, just because the climate community in California is so strong, and it's interesting that they didn't succeed there. If that was the big play for them.
Yeah, the one thing I would just add is I wouldn't necessarily read too much into this one ballot initiative as the face of a nation around EVs. I think there were very unique dynamics in California. And at the same time, New York overwhelmingly passed its own initiative for increased bond sales around environmental justice and climate initiatives. So I wouldn't read too much into this, but California will lose out on a lot more money for EVs.
Tanya, let's bring it back to DC. And you and your colleagues at Politico had reported on the risk that the GOP might try to slow down the infrastructure law. And we were just talking about how it might matter in the 24 elections as more of that money is going to get spent. Are they going to be able to do it through appropriations? What's the plan there? How real is that risk?
Well, nerd out with me for a minute here. The infrastructure bill included a lot of advanced appropriations. So usually there's an authorization bill that might be a multi-year bill. Surface transportation bills are often 5-year bills. So they will authorize the money for 5 years, but it's still up to appropriators year by year to actually appropriate that money. So the authorization says this is how much we want appropriators to give, but it's really the appropriators really hold those purse strings. So they did a lot of it through advanced appropriations, meaning that they actually appropriated all that money in 2021, and it's already there. That's for a lot of it, but it's still about a third of the bill that is subject to annual appropriations. My best guess, and this is after talking to some folks on the Republican side, I don't think that they're going to want to reduce the amount, but I do think that they are still going to want to go after some of the money that they see as just sort of sitting there left over from COVID relief bills and potentially other bills, and potentially, given that the infrastructure bill is going to be a slow spend, that there could just be money left over year after year that piles up over the 5-year course of the bill, that they say, we're not spending this money. Why are we appropriating more? We have all this money still sitting there. It hasn't been obligated. It hasn't been allocated. So I think that they aren't going to want to look like they're spending less. And the Republicans are, they voted against. It's a little bit of a complicated story. 19 Republicans voted for the bill. In the Senate, by the time it got over to the House, it got extremely polarized and wrapped up with Build Back Better, which became the Inflation Reduction Act, parts of it. So it got very, very political. Republicans did not like the process. They really didn't like the way Nancy Pelosi handled it. And only 13 Republicans ended up voting for the bill in the House. That said, they love when that money comes to their districts.
Yeah, you see them always tweeting about it, even if they didn't vote for it, right? They still like, yeah, and then here's a new bridge, or here's a new road. Thanks.
Sure. And it's not crazy. I mean, in many cases, I mean, they say as long as the money is there, it is my job and my responsibility to try to bring that money home to my constituents. And they do, they're writing to DOT and having meetings and promoting the projects in their communities. And then they're celebrating their victories when they get the funds. And in some cases it's competitive grants. And in some cases it's just this fire hose of formula money that just goes to states based on a formula that was written many, many years ago based on factors that don't even make sense anymore. So that's all a long way of saying, I think that in some cases they will try to take money from other places to use for the infrastructure bills, kind of pots of funding. But I think that those pots will stay the same.
So is there any risk there with some of the EV money to this discretion that Congress has over the next couple of years?
I don't see it.
Yeah.
I don't. I really think that those the money for, I mean, there's so many different pots of money, and honestly, you can describe them better than I can, Nick. But that we, for charging, for battery production,
Yeah.
there's for the tax incentives. I don't see. I feel like that money is out there and appropriate and moving, and I don't see major changes to that.
Okay, let's go back
We'll see if I'm right.
Yeah, wow, EVs skating by again. So Rebecca, you talked in your reporting on some work at the state commissions, a favorite place for us at Atlas, the group that helps regulate electric utilities. There were a number of key races you highlighted in your piece: Arizona, Louisiana, Texas. Can you talk a little bit about those and what happened there?
Yeah, so utilities are really important for ensuring, like, as we electrify vehicles, that the electricity is coming from clean sources rather than coal and gas. So yeah, these utilities, I think, for the climate community have played this increasingly visible role as a very important regulator for ensuring or mapping out this cleaner future. So yeah, there were a few states on my radar because there was potential for more pro-climate candidates to gain a foothold on these commissions. So that was in Louisiana, Arizona, and then Texas is slightly different, but the Texas Railroad Commission, which does a lot of environmental work. So what actually ended up happening was the status quo was kept in a lot of these races. So Republicans or the more the partisanship doesn't always break down as simply as federal politics, but basically the more deferential to utility status quo candidates have they won. But I think this is still an area to really closely watch. So Arizona, those margins were so tight between the candidates. I think in the campaigning that candidates were increasingly talking about climate change and the role it plays for these commissions. So I think, like, this is not going away. Louisiana is also interesting to watch because of its role in larger regulatory bodies. So Louisiana has kind of blocked large clean energy transmission projects. So that is an area where, like, if environmental candidates gained a foothold, it would make a big difference. And then Texas still has a Republican for the Republican majority for the Texas Railroad Commission. But the Democrat who was a long shot the entire time, he did talk a lot about climate. I think that's relatively new for Texas just to see that. So I will keep watching how that plays out in future elections. And I think we're definitely seeing these races pop up as also a battleground for lots of money in politics and lots of both corporate interest and environmental interest in these races. So this isn't going away.
It's super fascinating because, the running theme that I'm getting from both of your comments so far is that, the public was basically comfortable with the status quo, keeping a lot of folks who were already in power, and in some cases switching parties, like in the M states, as you mentioned, Rebecca. But some of those states were already pretty blue. So that's an interesting kind of takeaway, especially when you consider what the coverage was in the media and what the rhetoric was from politicians about waves of change coming and people really upset about what was going on. It just didn't seem to materialize. So I'd be remiss if I didn't want to ask you all before we go about what's coming up. We have two great reporters here covering a lot of the issues we care about on the show. Tell us what you're paying attention to. What do you expect to cover in the next couple of weeks or next month or so?
I can tell you what I'm going to be covering in the next couple hours and days, which is the potential for a railroad strike, and that is a climate story in part because rail is somewhere between 3 and 9 times, depending how you measure, more energy efficient than trucks. We have a truck driver shortage anyway, and there's no way that we could put all of the goods that were going by rail onto trucks because of there aren't enough trucks, there aren't enough drivers, and the logistics would just be a complete mess. So that is something that, that's what's been taking up all my time this week, and will continue to until the Senate figures this out. And it's also just an energy story because road transports coal and it transports ethanol and, ingredients of diesel. So a shutdown could potentially have really significant ripple effects throughout the energy world.
Rebecca, what about you?
A lot. So one top thing is implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act. So lots of tax incentives kick in January 1st. And I think a lot of this law will depend on communication from the administration and the ease of this for consumers to actually apply for or get their hands on this technology. And that also will rely on a lot of middlemen like contractors and car salesmen to be able to communicate on this as well. So I think that entire rollout is something I'm keeping an eye on. On the other side of things, I think the entire supply chain mystery around how the US will meet some of the rules inside IRA of having certain materials made in the US will be a really fascinating area to watch. That's particularly true for the auto sector. So I think another area I'm watching is battery recycling for lithium ion batteries. This is a industry that is almost non-existent right now in the US. There's only a couple of startups doing this, but there's a lot of new federal money that will be available for developing plants that are capable of recycling the materials in lithium ion batteries. So the US can actually meet these US made requirements. So this is like a really interesting area because we will see this potentially homegrown manufacturing industry in a country where we're not used to new manufacturing. One other area that we talked about earlier that I find fascinating is this growing, swirling controversy. Wow. Controversy over ESG. And this is an area that Republicans in the House have already promised investigations over and subpoenas for places like BlackRock and Vanguard. So this is not something that's going away. I think right now for the public and for my readers, I feel like there's still a lot of confusion over just what ESG is. So I think that's an issue that that Democrats, climate advocates are also finding their way to communicate around. So that's just another area to watch. I will have some more stories on that soon.
Wow, these are super nerdy topics, but really important. And one of the things I noticed that overlap between what Tanya, you were saying, and Rebecca is just the industrialization or reindustrialization of the US. There's like so much attention being put on manufacturing, jobs, how to get things from point A to point B, that it's clear that is top of mind for a lot of policymakers and companies, because one of the things that I think we all learned coming out of COVID is that supply chain is tight. And when it doesn't work very well, things really get bad pretty quick. And so I totally am excited to keep following y'all and see how some of these things play out. So really greatly appreciate you both joining me on EV Hub Live. And so we're going to sign off for this time. I'm Nick Nigro. Thanks for joining us. Bye now.